Dear friends of the Hellenic Center and the Greek Language and Culture Lab, I'm Xydopoulos and I teach linguistics at the Department of Philology of the University of Patras. I wish to thank my dear friends and colleagues at the Hellenic Center and at the Greek Language Lab for inviting me to this event. My lecture will be about a very popular subject, that is, about language myths, as opposed to the scientific truth put forward by linguistics, the science of language. Obviously, I will focus my attention to language myths about Greek. Before we go on to discussing language myths, it is important to understand that speakers that speak a language as their mother tongue are considered native speakers. In other words, they are perfect speakers of their language. However, native speakers, unless specially educated as linguists, do not have special knowledge that would enable them to explain in scientific terms various issues regarding the linguistic phenomenon, that is, about the structure of language, its lexicon, or issues concerning its history or its use. These are issues that can only be addressed by science, in this case, by linguistics. Similarly, medicine can answer questions about human health. Lawyers can answer questions about law. Seismologists can answer questions about earthquakes, etc. As is the case with all sciences, linguistics studies the linguistic phenomenon without sentimentality and by taking distance from it, while it applies objective methods and tools equally to all languages so as to find answers to numerous questions regarding language, its knowledge and use. What are language myths? Given that language users know the language, they build strong opinions about it and disseminate them in the community. These opinions are indeed what we call language myths. These myths are expressed in social interactions and nowadays mostly through social networks like Facebook and the media. Most of these opinions are strongly established and they come to form part of our culture and identity. However, these people have not scientific knowledge about the language, so they ignore or misunderstand what modern linguistics says about language and all its dimensions. As linguists, we react to these myths. In this talk, I will try to present a sample of our reactions to popular myths and stress what linguistics says about them. Usually we react to them by saying, hold on guys, things about language are not that simple. You need to discuss it thoroughly. You need to analyze it using acceptable scientific methods. Linguistics is not a straightforward discipline, as the phenomenon itself is extremely complex. Linguistics is not only about language history, as most people believe. Linguistics concerns all aspects of language. Therefore, issues about it need to be addressed with proper argumentation and by understanding basic concepts about language and linguistics. Our reactions to language myths can differ. Sometimes we find that the language myth is absolutely erroneous. Some other times we find that people are confused. Some other times that the language myth is based on false evidence, or that a myth violates fundamental scientific principles. I believe we all know that language myths exist about all languages, not only about Greek. Languages with a rich written tradition suffer more. Language myths are usually similar across languages and are related to language history, language quality, language decay, mathematical logic in language, orthography, difficulty learning a language, child language, mistakes in using a language, bad pronunciation, language variety, etc. Language myths can also be improbable or ridiculous, that there is no use for science to talk about them. Of course, we all laugh about them. For example, the final N on the article of Greek, teliko ni, in the accusative, they say it can oxygenate the brain, or that learning an ancient Greek can cure dyslexia, or that Greek possesses a lexical stock of more than 4,500,000 words, or that English is a dialect of Greek. We can only laugh about improbable, ridiculous language myths, can we? Yes, but we have to bear in mind that in many cases, these ridiculous myths can be dangerous as they are disseminated in sensible environments and activities like in language education. They can hide fanatic and extremist ideologies that aim to discriminate against individuals, against peoples and cultures on qualitative elitist grounds with very unenviable consequences, as we have seen many times in modern history. Many conflicts between humans are due also to language issues. So if we say that these people speaks a language that is inferior to mine, or that my culture as expressed by my language is superior to the one of other peoples, etc., then we express a dangerous view that certainly cannot be disseminated in the educational environment. We don't have time to discuss all myths that are around. We will see important and dangerous myths about language in general and Greek in particular. We will see what linguistics can say about each one of them and how they can be busted using proper scientific arguments. In our discussion, we will also try to understand how the history of Greek, the relation between ancient and modern Greek, the Greek language issue and diglossia between the puristic and the popular type, that is Katharevousa and Demotiki, have contributed to the creation, establishment, and dissemination of these myths in society and education. By language myth of a general nature, I refer to general strong opinions of users that apply to any language. So these general language myths are things like the ones you see on the table. People believe and insist that linguists have to judge which languages are good and which languages are bad. Linguists have to determine what is correct or incorrect use of language. Some accents are better than others. Chinese is difficult even if it's learned as a native language. So let us see what linguistics can say about them. I believe that most of you have heard of them and perhaps you have thought about them, or maybe you have believed in their truth. Let us see how we can bust each one of them. The first myth is that linguists have to judge which languages are good and which languages are bad. Linguists are scientists whose mission is to observe, describe, and explain all aspects of the linguistic phenomenon by objectively applying recognized scientific methods for language analysis and by drawing subjective conclusions. There are no recognized methods or tools that could evaluate or measure the goodness or badness of a language as compared to another language. So this claim is false by definition. So no one can suggest to us what is meant by a good or a bad language, given that languages are equivalent in communication. And we cannot say that native speakers of a language X communicate better than those of a language Y. Linguists have to determine what is correct or incorrect use of language. This is our second general language myth. Here too, the answer is of course no. They're not expected to do so. Modern linguistics is a proper science founded on objectivity. As we said earlier, linguistics, scientific claims, methods, results, and linguistics themselves are not or should not be influenced by particular perspectives, value judgments, community bias, or personal interests. Linguistics is interested in language description in order to understand how we humans speak and understand our mother tongue but also how children acquire the language. These are fundamental questions that linguistics is expected to answer. Giving answers to these questions is not only of theoretical importance, it is more of an applied value that enables us to improve methods of language teaching, to discover treatments for speakers with language impairment, to improve foreign language teaching. So linguistics is not interested in prescription, that is, in correcting or dictating to native speakers how they should use their own language. Linguists do not belong to some language police force that crusade for a particular usage or omission within a language. Native speakers are considered perfect users of their mother tongue. They have perfectly learned the language through an unconscious predefined procedure, unique to humans, during the first decade or so of their lives. Therefore, they're not expected to make mistakes. The so-called mistakes of language use, especially in Greek, are related exclusively to expressions of learned origins and are indications of upcoming language changes. These old expressions have to be learned by speakers on purpose, through education. The myth that some accents are better than others is also one that wrongly implies the existence of some qualitative evaluation method. As we said earlier, this is not available in modern linguistics. How can we possibly judge whether an accent is better than another? Is it better to pronounce the word lycos, wolf, in standard Greek as lykos, or in the variety, say, of Patras as lykos? So, is the lateral consonant sound L better than the palatal consonant sound L, and on what grounds? In other words, I cannot think of a criterion that could evaluate a better or a worse accent. In linguistics and in phonetics and dialectology in particular, all different accents of Greek are equivalent, as it is the case with all different dialectal varieties. Unfortunately, this distinction between good and bad accents is quite dominant in the Greek schooling environment, and many pupils have suffered bullying from other classmates because of their rural accent. Another general myth, the last of them we will discuss in this lecture, is that Chinese is difficult even if it is learned as a native language. This myth draws its origin from the difficulties of learning how to write using a Chinese writing system, which is logographic and not alphabetical. This difficulty mainly concerns users of Western languages that have alphabetical writing. It is true that learning Chinese as a foreign language may present some additional learning difficulties for students whose first language is intonational, as Greek, and not a tone language, as is Chinese. Certainly Chinese, as every one of the 6,000 human languages spoken today, can be acquired as a mother tongue by any human child. A child acquiring his or her mother tongue applies the language acquisition process in an unconscious, systematic, and steady manner. Any child can learn Chinese as his or her mother tongue on the condition that the child is exposed to a Chinese-speaking environment during the first 10 years of their life. The same will happen with any other human language spoken today. We have completed our short journey through a sample of general language myths, and we can now move on to language myths that are more relevant for Greek. Of course, this could be also adapted to other languages, by just changing some keywords. We will discuss the following Greek language myths. Knowing modern Greek presupposes good knowledge of ancient Greek. Modern Greek is getting worse. Lexical borrowing corrupts our language. Greek language is characterized by continuity. Modern Greek orthography is very important for our language. Modern Greek has 7 vowels. The majority of these myths are based on an erroneous perception about language history and of the relation between our language, Modern Greek, and one of its earlier stages, the so-called Ancient Greek. By the term Ancient Greek, we refer to just one particular dialect spoken around 500 to 300 BC in the ancient city-state of Athens, the so-called Attic dialect. Other stages or dialects before or after Attic Greek are not taken into consideration in this debate. Therefore, these myths draw their origin from a distorted perception of the history of Greek. Let us see and discuss separately each one of these Greek language myths. Knowing Modern Greek presupposes good knowledge of Ancient Greek, they say. This is a very popular myth that had also been the basis for language education policy in Greece recently. This opinion had led to the increase of teaching hours for Ancient Greek to the detriment of teaching Modern Greek to pupils in school. This policy led to a poor teaching and learning experience of pupils in their native language, as well as to the degeneration of the teaching of Ancient Greek in schools. As a result, school graduates did not manage to get sufficient metalinguistic knowledge about their native language and ignore the essence of Ancient Greek language and literature. Knowing our native language does not presuppose the knowledge of earlier stages in its evolution. Earlier stages of Modern Greek includes Ancient Greek, which linguistics consider a dead language, as it does not have any native speakers. The same holds for Latin, Sanskrit, and all other ancient languages. In addition, the structure of Modern Greek is much different from that of Ancient Greek. For example, the phonetic system has changed and the language has shifted from tone to intonation. The case system has also changed as dative has been fused, for example, into accusative and prepositional case. The tense and aspect system is also quite different, both morphological and semantically, as it was in Ancient Greek. It is certain that knowing about the earlier stage of our language can enrich our knowledge about our native language, but cannot be a condition for learning or acquiring it. This is straightforwardly understood if we refer to the language acquisition process. If this was true, then speakers, for example, of modern Romance languages like French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, etc., would have to know Latin. Let us move on to the myth that Modern Greek is getting worse. Here too, we need to ask ourselves whether there is some acknowledged method for measuring language decay or decline, but linguistics does not possess such a method. Talking about the language getting worse stems from the assumption that there are perfect languages. That is, classical languages like Ancient Greek and Latin. The idea of perfect languages is based on the study of classical literature. So speakers of these perfect languages are considered to be superior, while users of modern languages like Modern Greek are inferior speakers. This ideological approach to language originates from the rhetorical movement of Atticism in the late Hellenistic period, which regarded Attic Greek as having particular literary elegance. By denying the existence of perfect versus non-perfect languages, the whole argument is confuted, as we cannot compare between better or worse languages. Another popular myth is that lexical borrowing corrupts our language. On the opposite, lexical borrowing is a natural mechanism of language enrichment and not a parameter of corruption. Lexical borrowing constantly enriches the lexical stock of languages and is a mechanism that functions mutually among languages. All languages borrow from other languages. Actually, English, a very dominant and powerful language, a powerful lender that influences other languages, like Greek, is also a very popular borrower. What is the definition of lexical borrowing and of a lexical loan? Any item that enters our language is a loan. That is the result of borrowing. There are different types of lexical loans. The most important are the so-called direct loans, items that enter the borrowing language in their original foreign form, like the words tractor, tractor, computer, toast, toast, that were borrowed from English into modern Greek. The so-called internationalisms, items borrowed from another language, but originally coming from the composition of internationalized elements of the borrowing language. For example, Greek internationalisms like microbio, microbe, ecosystema, ecosystem, biologia, biology, telefono, telephone, that were formed in other languages like English or French, and then they were imported into Greek. Also, the so-called diachronic loans, that is, any lexical items that a language borrows from its early stages, like the words υπουργός, minister, petinos, rooster, and spiti, house, that earlier had different meanings than they have today. Lexical loans enrich our language's lexical stock, regardless of how much they are adapted to the grammatical system of our language. A borrowed word, by the time it is pronounced in our language, as I just did with my examples, it forms part of our lexicon. So this is a constant rejuvenation process that benefits our language and not a corruption. Fairly recently, a well-known emeritus professor of linguistics, George Babiniotis, posted the little table that you see on the slide on his Facebook wall. And in this table, Professor Babiniotis argued against direct lexical borrowing. And in particular, he claimed that direct loans must not be imported into Greek in their original form, but instead, they must be translated into Greek. The particular discussion was about three very frequent borrowed words these days, namely lockdown, delivery, and takeaway. Professor Babiniotis proposes translations of these words of English origin that are rather unsuitable for everyday use. Although translating loanwords is another type of borrowing, the so-called calking or else translation borrowing, this cannot apply to all foreign words entered in our language. The procedure is quite fruitful in special vocabularies, for example, of sciences and technologies, and not for everyday vocabulary. What Professor Babiniotis is actually doing here is to make people believe that direct borrowing is harmful for our language, and so he is demonizing lexical borrowing. Another popular myth is that Greek is characterized by continuity. There is no such thing as continuity in linguistics, meaning that a language remains intact through time. Actually, modern Greek does not have many common features with ancient Greek. Pronunciation has changed dramatically, syntax and morphology too. Of course, a lot of words of ancient Greek origin have survived in modern Greek as diachronic loans, but with substantial changes in their meaning and use. Greek, as is the case with all other natural languages, changes through time. Today's version of Greek is the result of numerous changes during the millennia of its evolution. Language change is caused by both extrinsic and intrinsic factors. Intrinsic changes are caused by the linguistic system itself, constantly changing. Extrinsic changes are caused by factors like contact with other languages. Indications of the changes happening in the language are the so-called language mistakes that usually indicate a normalization or balancing of linguistic expression according to current system restrictions. There are numerous examples of such mistakes. Από ανέκαθεν, all along, πιο καλύτερος or καλύτερότερος, διαρρέω την πληροφορία, leak the information, παρέτησαν τον υπουργό, they resigned the minister. Η πληροφορία επεξεργάστηκε από τον φοιτητή, the information was processed by the student, etc. These mistakes show that speakers in using diachronic loans from older stages of Greek try to adapt them to the grammatical system of the current language, so they add the preposition apo to the ancient adverb anekathen, or they use the comparative particle πιο in order to form the comparative degree of all adjectives and adverbs without exceptions, or they turn an intransitive verb like diarrheo into a transitive, so forming active sentences with it, or they add an active version to passive verbs like paretume, or they allow a morphological passive to be realized as a syntactic passive, etc. All these are considered as language mistakes, but they actually show how diachronic expressions are being normalized and balanced so as to meet the criteria of modern Greek grammatical rules. This table shows some language mistakes that are frequent and cannot be excused, as the title suggests. Tables like that usually appear in books that try to regulate language use by demonizing these mistakes and by incriminating language users. All expressions appearing in this table are diachronic loans from earlier stages of Greek. All these malformations by native speakers of modern Greek can be easily accounted for if we think that speakers do not have access to grammatical rules of earlier Greek. So for them, for example, a word ending in os is taken to be masculine, and so it must be conjugated as masculine. So the word ψήφος, vote, although feminine, would be gradually turned into a masculine noun and take the masculine article and ο ψήφος instead of the old word η ψήφος. The table also includes expressions of learned origin that were formed sometime in the past using the grammatical rules of the past. These rules are not naturally known to modern Greek speakers through the process of language acquisition. These learned expressions must be learned by speakers through teaching in school. Otherwise, they will continue to be used erroneously. Let us now see another issue that concerns modern Greek orthography that for many people is very important for our language. This view is quite popular, especially in the educational environment where a worshipping attitude towards orthography has developed. Orthography or spelling is a conventional system for writing oral language that was invented by people in order to create a permanent record of their oral speech. This system is shared by all members of the same linguistic community in order to exchange written information with each other. The conventionality of orthography shows to us that we should not worship it, but instead we should treat it as something that can be modified anytime the community feels so for practical reasons. Languages with a historical written tradition have a historical, rather a phonetic spelling system. This is the case with Greek too. The problem is that the mechanism of language change that affects our language as a living organism cannot at all influence spelling, since it is a static and not a dynamic system. There have been efforts in the past to modify the Greek spelling system that extended from phonetizing to Latinizing it. The modifications that were approved by law, for example in 1984, did not change the alphabet, but led to the abolition of the polytonic system in favor of a monotonic system that correctly reflected the fact that modern Greek has dynamic stress and not prosody, as was the case with ancient Greek. Of course, there are examples of languages whose spelling system totally changed for practical or even political reasons. Think, for example, the case of Turkish, which changed from Arabic to Latin. Keeping the historical spelling system is mostly useful for practical reasons, that is, to facilitate reading of older texts or to recognize etymological information and the like. We linguists do not have any aspirations to change our alphabet, neither to phonetize or Latinize it. Any changes in the future will only be imposed by the needs of the community at that particular time. It is interesting to note that users, whether they know how to spell correctly or not, or whether they willingly ignore spelling rules, have the right to make their own choices in writing the language. Here we see different erroneous spellings of Greek. It is clear in these two cases that show wall writings, misspelling is purposeful in order to provoke the readers. The first case attempts to suppress canonical word boundaries and simplify writing in order to puzzle the reader. The second case is an anarchist slogan against spelling that uses complex rather than simple graphemes in order to attract attention, showing also that spelling convention is absolutely arbitrary. These two cases here are hand-painted signs that show that the creator perhaps did not go to school and so did not learn how to spell correctly. In both cases, the creator selects complex instead of simple graphemes in order to feign literacy by highlighting historical spelling. So we agree that we should not worship orthography since it is a human invention that codifies the written recording of our language. Apart from the case of the monotonic system, the Greek spelling has been through other modifications that focused on the simplification of spelling in particular environments and words of a particular origin and nature. So we have the cases of having alternative spelling for foreign loanwords like treno, train, that in the past was spelled as treno, mimicking the French or English spelling of the word. Its spelling was simplified to treno, using the simple grapheme epsilon instead of the complex grapheme alpha iota for the sound e. The same for the word αυγό, that in the past was spelled as αυγό, using the complex grapheme alpha epsilon, pronounced as av, for the sound v, instead of the simple grapheme vita. Both simplifications were proposed for practical reasons and because the old spellings of these words did not reveal anything important about the history or the formation of the word. Similarly, Greeklish, a case of Latin spelling for Greek in the digital age, cannot harm our language, as many people suggest, as it is just an alternative way of writing Greek in electronic communication and social media so as to avoid encoding problems. Apart from encoding that has actually been resolved in the majority of, if not all, computer systems, users of digital devices still face practical difficulties with Greek spelling that have to do with the writing speed, as writing in Greek presupposes the accentuation of words. Alternatively, we see users opting for writing either in Greeklish or fairly recently for writing in Greek without putting accents or on words or by capitalizing their texts. This proves once again that spelling is completely conventional and that users who deviate from the canonical Greek spelling do so only for practical reasons. So the myth about the utmost importance of spelling in Greek and other languages is also busted. The last language myth about Greek that we will discuss in this lecture has to do with the number of vowels in modern Greek. Phonetically speaking, modern Greek has 5 vowels, namely A, E, I, O, U. Since the system does not include anymore the feature of vowel length, that is, long versus short vowels, as it was the case in ancient Greek. These 5 vowels are represented in historical orthography by 9 graphemes, namely alpha, epsilon, alpha iota, iota, ypsilon, eta, omicron iota, epsilon iota, omicron ypsilon. The confusion between pronunciation and writing, as well as the conflation of the 2 different grammars, that of modern Greek with that of ancient Greek, thanks to the myth of continuity that we discussed earlier, has led a lot of people, including language teachers, to believe and argue that vowels in modern Greek are 7 and not 5. 8 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about whether the modern Greek phonetic system has 7 or 5 vowels. The cause for that discussion was the publication in 2012 of a new school grammar book for pupils of the 5th and the 6th grade, where there was a clear distinction between sounds and graphemes as shown in the snapshot on the slide, where sounds are in bags, okay, and are shown in square brackets, as you see. Those who fought against the new school grammar argued that the new book goes against Manolis Triantafyllidis' school grammar that was published in 1947, and which they said spoke about 7 and not 5 vowels. Unfortunately, these people had never read Triantafyllidis' grammar book. There, the same distinction was made absolutely clear between sounds and graphemes, as we can see in the snapshot from that grammar. Sounds are clearly distinguished from graphemes, and vowels in modern Greek are 5 and not 7. I hope I managed to show to you that language myths are indeed myths that can easily be busted by the truth of linguistics, the science responsible for explaining the phenomenon of language. Those of you interested in matters about language, you can explore linguistics by reading simple introductions to the discipline that are readily available either in print or electronically. Reading linguistics will help you recognize these and other myths about language and be able to bust them by yourself. A linguistics introductory book in English that I could recommend is that by George Yule, entitled The Study of Language, from Cambridge University Press. And a good introductory linguistics book in Greek is that by Phivos Panagiotidis, entitled Mila Mou ya Glossa, Talk to Me About Language, from Crete University Press. Thank you very much for watching this lecture. Bye-bye.